Welcome to Exhibition. And hello, Elefteria Vlavianos.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm well and delighted to see you there. Your exhibition is The Threaded Line at M Contemporary in Sydney. And maybe we could begin with a little of your cultural heritage, because this is very important to the nature and the provenance of the works in many ways. So tell us a little about that link to your cultural heritage, and specifically all the way back to your grandmother and what impact she had.
Well, I grew up mostly with my Armenian grandparents. As traditionally in any, I guess, ethnic community, grandchildren are left with their grandparents. Ours was a very tight-knit family. And for as far as I can remember, and as a child, both my Armenian grandmother, Elizabeth Babayan, and my Greek grandmother, who shares my name, Elefteria Vlavianos, both of them were hat milliners. They were seamstresses and they were embroiderers. So I grew up in a milieu that was always with textiles, embroidering. And I don't ever not remember having that kind of material connection to anything that was aesthetic or in regards to beauty or making, etc.
And was it at that point that your fascination with the concept and the possibilities of the thread, the threaded and woven line, came to develop?
I think so. I mean, my mother was very artistic. She was a very good draftsperson. We have other painters. I have great aunts who were portrait painters and still life painters. And so the household was full of art as well. They were collectors. But somehow, from very young, I was made to embroider, and I'm actually absolutely useless at doing it. So whereas I was fascinated with my mother's paint box and the paint that she had and the smell of paint, and I was always drawing. And somehow I realized as I got older that the connection between the line and threader's line, etc., that interchangeability between the two was always there. And it kind of made sense to me. You know, I would like to play with threads, but then I would make figures out of them. You know, I wouldn't necessarily be sitting there doing a stitch. So somehow deeply buried in my childhood from, you know, age of about 2 or 3, this has kind of been there. And the other thing about the threads, and I suppose we'll talk about this later, about color, is that when I immigrated to Australia, I hadn't quite cottoned on to this concept, but of course the threads that they were using and the color systems that we're using was itself a palette. And it's a palette that I learned very, very young from those embroidery threads, from the materials that they had, and from the collection of Oriental and Armenian carpets in the house. So you know, it's only as an adult and as I began to really get into my work and started asking myself questions about why certain colors were so prevalent in my work, that these little connections, you know, come into the foreground. You begin to think about them.
And is there a broader cultural connection in terms of Armenian men being in some way identified with stone and Armenian women being identified with thread? And your works, in some ways, through their obvious representation of threads, but maybe their more subtle representation of stone through pigments and coloration. Are you essentially bringing that, again, that cultural background actively into the works?
Absolutely, because, you know, again, I'll go back to my personal history. My grandmother belongs obviously to the Armenian diaspora. She was actually born in Turkey under the Ottoman Empire at the fall of it. She lived to about 97, although she used to fudge her age. And she actually lived in 11 countries. They were refugees about 5 times. You know, they went through this kind of process. And in terms of my Armenian heritage and the research that I've done into that. And she used to tell me, you know, women are the keepers of the thread, because this is the way in which I can tell you about your visual culture. And my grandmother used to always say to me, and men are the keepers of stone, because the tradition of carving a khachka, which I don't know if you've ever seen, but they're these monolithic stones that are very intricately carved out with a Christian cross. And they used to be scattered all over Armenia.
Now that you've given us a sense of perhaps where the genesis of the use of line and thread for you was through your grandmother and through those Armenian traditions, take us more to the use of the line and the significance of the line for you in the works that you now create.
I guess the thing about line, and another part of my research, is that I'm absolutely obsessed with painting, the language of painting, and maybe more specifically abstraction. So the issue of the line for me is, in a way, that element that I can begin to manipulate both ways. I can play a game with it. I can be more abstract, and I can take it to that point of almost kind of wanting to break it. And then on the other hand, I can use it as a single element, as one thing that might be able to remake something from the past. And it's that kind of dialogue, that kind of interchange that draws me to the line, but also in general to abstraction.
Can I take you to something you've said in the past, which is that for you, all painting is both abstract and representational?
Yes, absolutely. I don't understand.
How is that the case for you?
I suppose part of this links to the fact that I grew up in Southern Africa. And so I also grew up, and this is where everything gets really complicated, with African art. You know, and as a child, I never questioned things that were seemingly that the West may say, oh, this is abstract, or this is ethnographic art, or this is X. It's simply that it is a work of art, full stop, and it is both representational, it is non-representational, it is both mystic, it is not mystic. It has all these things. Every picture from the beginning of time is abstract to a point, and every picture, as far as I'm concerned, is also representational. I mean, when I'm painting, I'm not painting the image as such. The image comes, the image, and people say to me, oh, you're process driven. And I don't even know if I'm process driven. It's the material, it's a combination of the materiality and me working that brings about the image. I have some idea, but sometimes the painting declares itself in another way, and you have to let it be. And that's the challenge of a painter.
As an individual stands in front of one of your works, they might well be struck by both the strength and the fragility of the line and then the interconnected line. Is that interplay, that tension between strength and fragility, something that's important in your works?
That's a lovely way of putting it. I think it goes back to that idea of being on the borderline of something, you know. I think for me personally, a viewer looking at my work it's not necessary that they know my history. It's not necessary that they understand the complexity of it. I'm hoping that they will find something that at least when they look at it, they can look at it many times over, and they can be between those two positions. And I am conscious of the fact that when I'm painting, I want those two elements to be kind of butted up against each other in the painting, because in a way, especially today, we are saturated with moving images. We have our iPhone, you know, you can just click onto the internet and see something. A painting is a still thing, you know, it requires you to go and look at it. But I'm hoping that the viewer, with the language that I'm using, with the abstract language that I'm using, can come to that painting many times over and have some kind of experience. And those kind of elements, fragility and strength, seen and unseen, visible, invisible, they're playing there. That's what I would like someone to find within the work.
With some works, there are clear shapes within the weaving of the threads, and other works are a more uniform covering of the surface. What's going on there in those different approaches?
I guess the work behind here is very controlled in a way. You know, it's much more towards the formal. It's much more towards the pared back and put down and controlled. In some works, it doesn't work like that. And sometimes, and I've been thinking about this in my practice, you know, paintings can be very romantic. You know, what we do is romantic. The idea of the painter is romantic, but the process is also romantic. And there is a kind of, for me, a kind of play between these two things. I can make a work that's much more moody. I kind of want it sexy. I kind of want it to have a romance with that surface. At that point, when the surface and the layering has come to a place where I can then begin to think about tacking on top of it or stitching on top of it, in a way that surface then dictates to me in what I'm going to do. I may well have had a very clear idea, but this is when the conversation happens, you know, then I need to let go and I acquiesce to the surface. To some point, the painting dictates how I'm going to respond to it. Sometimes I'm very clear about it and I stitch it up and I work with what's happening with the ground of the painting. And sometimes I want the ground of the painting to be discovered. So by putting a complete film on top of it, the viewer can then transgress between those shallow layers and be caught between them and come out.
Can you explain for us just a little about the materials and the ingredients, so to speak, that go into the works? Because I know that you use a lot of pigments, and that certainly atmospheric conditions can very much affect how they're laid down. Tell us about that.
Well, I think the use of pigments, again, relates back to the issue of stones, and that I'm interested in pigments because of where they come from. I guess they're linked to place in terms of concept and the idea of what I'm doing. In terms of the materiality and the practice of painting, of course, being half Greek, I grew up with icon painting, and I, you know, had an aunt who was an icon painter and so worked with egg tempera. I don't use egg tempera at this scale, partly because I don't like the smell of eggs. I don't like them going off.
For a very practical reason.
And so I choose to use with acrylic and pigment, and I can, you know, grind it up or add it to the paint that I'm using. I make my own colors in the process, and then I let them stand for ages and get rid of the gunk, and then add in the pigment to get a particular kind of surface, to get it velvet. And that links me obviously back to material, the material feeling of a woven fabric. So for these works, I like to work with pigment and I like to work with acrylic paint.
Can you take us now to some of the watercolor-based works in this exhibition, which visually appear substantially different to the larger works like the ones we've been discussing, in a sense, somewhat more active, somewhat maybe more dynamic in their range of colour and movement. What's your feel with regard to them?
Works on paper for me are both paintings and drawings. When I work on paper, I can fill it up as much as I like. I can kind of push the imagery and the motifs and everything into that little space. That particular body of work came out of research at the British Library, looking at the motifs that were within the Armenian manuscripts, and as much play as possible. I mean, I like them and I try and imagine them really big, but I like them small because they have a relationship to illuminated paintings, to that idea of being really full and kind of, you know, jewel-like. But I'm doing it, I'm taking an image and then I'm kind of breaking it down within that little sphere. They're also a platform for this work because the base of those paintings is the woven line. And in my research, I explained that the woven line is a net. It's a catcher of things. So it prepares the ground for me to kind of explore other things on it. And that's where that work comes from. And there's a large body of it. It also talks to this work in another way. While I'm trying to empty out the process and only work with one thing, that is the kind of contrapuntal shift to what the bigger paintings are, and back and forth. So, yeah.
Well, your threaded lines have taken us on a fascinating journey. So, Elefteria Vlavianos, thanks very much for sharing your exhibition with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure.